In the basement of a modest brownstone in Philadelphia, police discovered 37 human bodies in various states of decomposition, none of them identified, none of them claimed, and none of them reported missing. The year was 1889, and the man responsible would become known as America's most disturbing pathologist. This is the story of Dr. Edmund Mercer, a respected member of Philadelphia's medical community by day, and by night, a man whose obsession with death led him down a path so dark that even today, over a century later, we still don't know the full extent of his crimes. Philadelphia in 1889 was a city of stark contrasts. Gas lamps flickered against the grimy brick facades of tenements, while horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestone streets slick with rain and worse. The city's wealthy districts boasted elegant Victorian mansions, but venture into the narrow alleyways of the working-class neighborhoods, and you'd find a different world entirely, one where life was cheap, death was common, and people disappeared without anyone asking questions. Dr. Edmund Mercer lived at the intersection of these two worlds. His practice on Chestnut Street catered to Philadelphia's elite, politicians, businessmen, and their families, who trusted him with their most delicate medical concerns. Mercer was 43 years old, impeccably dressed, with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. His colleagues described him as brilliant but cold, a man who spoke of human anatomy with the detachment of someone discussing the weather. But it was Mercer's second profession that would ultimately define his legacy. As one of the city's most prominent pathologists, he was called upon to examine the dead, to determine cause of death, to make sense of the mysteries that bodies carried with them into the morgue. And it was in this role, surrounded by the silence of the dead, that Dr. Mercer's darker nature began to emerge. The first sign that something was amiss came in the spring of 1888, when Dr. Jonathan Hayes, a fellow pathologist, paid an unexpected visit to Mercer's private laboratory in the basement of his home. Hayes had come to discuss a particularly puzzling case they'd been working on together, a young woman found dead in the Schuylkill River with no apparent cause of death. What Hayes found in that basement would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to Hayes's journal, which was discovered decades later in his estate, the basement of Mercer's home was unlike anything he had ever seen. The space had been converted into what appeared to be a fully functional morgue, complete with examination tables, glass cabinets filled with surgical instruments, and rows upon rows of glass jars containing human organs suspended in formaldehyde. But it was what lay on the examination tables that made Hayes's blood run cold. Bodies. Not one or two, but more than a dozen, in various stages of dissection. Some appeared fresh, others had clearly been there for weeks or even months. But most disturbing of all was the meticulous care with which they had been preserved and studied. Each body bore detailed tags with notes written in Mercer's precise handwriting, observations about cause of death, unusual anatomical features, and theories about the circumstances that had led to their demise. Hayes wrote in his journal, "I have seen death in all its forms throughout my career, but never have I witnessed such a systematic collection of human remains." Dr. Mercer spoke of these people as specimens, not as souls who had once drawn breath and known love and fear. When I asked him where they had come from, he simply smiled and said they were his research subjects. The most chilling detail of all was that none of the bodies appeared to have been processed through official channels. There were no morgue tags, no death certificates, no records linking them to any known missing persons cases. They were, in Mercer's own words, the forgotten ones. people whose deaths had gone unnoticed and unmourned. Dr. Hayes faced an impossible decision. Mercer was not only a colleague, but a respected member of Philadelphia's medical establishment. Accusing him of impropriety based on what might be legitimate research could destroy Hayes's own career. But the image of those nameless bodies haunted him, and after several sleepless nights, he decided to confide in Detective Inspector Michael O'Brien of the Philadelphia Police Department. O'Brien was a shrewd investigator with 20 years of experience walking the city's darkest streets. He'd seen enough of human nature to know that evil often wore a respectable face. When Hayes described what he had witnessed in Mercer's basement, O'Brien didn't dismiss it as the overactive imagination of a squeamish doctor. Instead, he began a careful, quiet investigation into Dr. Edmund Mercer's activities. What O'Brien discovered was a pattern of behavior that stretched back nearly 5 years. Beginning in 1884, Mercer had been visiting the city's poorest neighborhoods with increasing frequency, always carrying his black medical bag and offering free medical examinations to those who couldn't afford proper health care. Witnesses described him as kind and generous, a wealthy doctor who took pity on the unfortunate. But O'Brien noticed something troubling in the testimonies he collected. Many of the people who had been treated by Mercer during these charitable visits were never seen again. When O'Brien pressed witnesses for details, they often became evasive, claiming the missing individuals had moved on or found work elsewhere. In a city where people struggled to survive day to day, such explanations were common enough to avoid suspicion. The detective began mapping out Mercer's visits, cross-referencing them with reports of missing persons in those neighborhoods. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. In nearly every case where Mercer had provided treatment to someone living alone with no family ties, that person had vanished within days of his visit. As O'Brien delved deeper into the investigation, he made contact with Mrs. Catherine Murphy, an elderly Irishwoman who lived in one of the tenements Mercer frequented. Mrs. Murphy had known many of the missing individuals personally, and she had grown suspicious of the well-dressed doctor who seemed to take such an interest in the neighborhood's most vulnerable residents. He had a way of asking questions, not just about your ailments, but about your family, whether anyone would miss you if you were gone. At first, I thought he was just being thorough, making conversation, but then Mary Donnelly disappeared right after he treated her for consumption, and then young Tommy Walsh vanished after complaining of stomach pains. Too many coincidences for my liking. Mrs. Murphy's testimony provided O'Brien with the evidence he needed to obtain a search warrant for Mercer's home. On the morning of October 15, 1889, O'Brien and a team of officers arrived at the brownstone on Rittenhouse Square. If you're finding this investigation as disturbing as we are, you're not alone. Thousands of viewers are discovering these dark chapters of medical history on this channel every week. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming episode about the asylum that erased patients' memories. Mercer answered the door himself, impeccably dressed as always, showing no sign of surprise or concern at the sight of the police officers. He was, O'Brien would later write, almost unnaturally calm, as if he'd been expecting this moment for some time. "Gentlemen," Mercer said, adjusting his cufflinks with steady hands, "I assume you're here about my research. I do hope you'll be careful with the specimens. Some of them are quite irreplaceable." The search of the basement revealed a scene that defied imagination. 37 bodies were arranged throughout the space, each at a different stage of examination and preservation. Mercer had kept detailed records of his work, documenting everything from the subjects' estimated ages and physical conditions to his theories about their causes of death. But it was Mercer's journal that provided the most disturbing insights into his methods and motivations. Written in his precise scholarly handwriting, the journal read like the work of a dedicated scientist,
except that his subjects were human beings who had trusted him with their lives. One entry, dated March 12, 1887, described his encounter with a young woman named Sarah Collins. Subject presented with advanced tuberculosis, malnourished, no known family or associates. Administered morphine solution with additional compounds for research purposes. Subject expired within 6 hours. Excellent preservation of lung tissue achieved. Note, subject's final moments suggest consciousness. Further study needed on consciousness during final stages. Another entry from August 1888 was even chilling. Vagrant male, approximately 35 years, claimed to suffer from chronic pain in abdomen. Administered experimental anesthetic compound. Subject remained conscious but paralyzed. Fascinating neurological response. Death occurred after 14 hours of observation. Remarkable clarity of the subject's fear response throughout process. The journal contained nearly 200 such entries, each describing what Mercer referred to as experimental treatments administered to patients from the city's poorest neighborhoods. In every case, the patient had died, and in every case, Mercer had preserved the body for further study. What made these entries particularly horrifying was Mercer's complete lack of remorse or recognition that he had committed murder. He wrote about his victims with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying insects, noting their reactions to various poisons and experimental procedures with the enthusiasm of a researcher making groundbreaking discoveries.
Dr. Edmund Mercer's trial began on January 8, 1890, and from the very first day, it was clear that this would be unlike any criminal proceeding the city had ever witnessed. The defendant showed no emotion as the prosecution detailed his crimes, occasionally taking notes as if he were attending a fascinating medical lecture rather than fighting for his life. The evidence against Mercer was overwhelming. In addition to the 37 bodies found in his basement, investigators had traced his movements through Philadelphia's poorest neighborhoods and identified nearly 60 additional victims who had disappeared after receiving his charitable medical care. The scope of his crimes was staggering. This was not a crime of passion or a single moment of madness, but a systematic campaign of murder carried out over nearly 5 years. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Mercer's own testimony. When called to defend himself, he showed no remorse and expressed no understanding that he had done anything wrong. Instead, he spoke at length about his contributions to medical science and his innovative research into the transition between life and death. These individuals, Mercer told the court, were already dying. I simply provided them with the opportunity to contribute something meaningful to humanity's understanding of mortality. Their deaths were not in vain. Each one taught us something valuable about the human condition. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Mercer was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that would be carried out on March 15, 1890. Even as he faced execution, Dr. Mercer remained unrepentant and oddly cooperative. He provided investigators with detailed information about his methods, the locations where he had disposed of additional bodies, and the names of victims whose identities had previously been unknown. He seemed to take pride in the thoroughness of his record-keeping and the scientific rigor of his approach to murder. But there was one question that Mercer refused to answer, no matter how much pressure was applied. How had he selected his victims? The pattern was clear. Mercer had targeted the city's most vulnerable residents,
people who lived alone and had no family to report them missing. But investigators suspected there was more to his selection process than simple opportunism. Several witnesses reported seeing Mercer observing potential victims for weeks before approaching them, studying their habits and routines with the patience of a predator. Mrs. Murphy, the elderly woman who had first reported her suspicions to the police, provided what may have been the most insightful observation about Mercer's methods. He wasn't just looking for people who wouldn't be missed. He was looking for people who had given up hope. You could see it in his eyes when he talked to them. He could sense despair like a bloodhound senses prey. On the morning of his execution, Mercer was asked if he had any final words. He looked out at the small crowd of witnesses and said, "Death is the greatest mystery of human existence. I have had the privilege of observing it more closely than perhaps any man in history. What I learned in those moments, watching consciousness fade, studying the precise instant when life becomes death, that knowledge dies with me today. Humanity is poorer for that loss." Dr. Edmund Mercer was hanged at dawn on March 15, 1890. But the horror of his crimes continued to reverberate through Philadelphia and beyond. The discovery of his basement laboratory forced the medical community to confront uncomfortable questions about the ethics of human experimentation and the ease with which a respected physician could prey upon society's most vulnerable members. The case also highlighted the invisibility of the poor in American society during the late 19th century. Mercer had been able to murder dozens of people over the course of 5 years because his victims were individuals whom society had already written off: immigrants, vagrants, and the chronically ill who existed on the margins of respectable life. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that Mercer might not have been unique. In the years following his execution, similar cases began to emerge in other cities. Doctors who had used their position of trust to exploit and harm their patients, particularly those who lacked the social connections to seek justice when wronged. The basement laboratory at Mercer's brownstone was sealed and eventually demolished, but stories persisted for decades about strange sounds and unexplained phenomena at the site. Some claimed to hear voices calling for help from beneath the ground, while others reported seeing a tall figure in a dark coat walking the streets of the neighborhood where so many of Mercer's victims had lived and died.
More than a century after Dr. Mercer's execution, questions about his crimes continue to haunt those who study this dark chapter of American medical history. How many victims were there really? Investigators identified nearly 100 individuals who had disappeared after contact with Mercer. But, given the transient nature of Philadelphia's poorest populations, the true number may never be known. What drove a man who had dedicated his life to healing to become one of history's most prolific serial killers? Mercer's own writings provide few clues to his psychological state. He wrote about murder with the same clinical detachment he brought to legitimate medical research, suggesting a complete inability to empathize with human suffering. And perhaps most troubling of all, how many other Dr. Mercers were there? How many physicians used their position of trust and authority to prey upon vulnerable patients? The medical establishment of the late 19th century was largely self-regulating, with few oversight mechanisms to prevent abuse. It's entirely possible that Mercer was simply the unlucky one who got caught. The case of Dr. Edmund Mercer serves as a stark reminder that evil often wears a respectable face. In a society that values expertise and authority, we must remain vigilant against those who would exploit our trust. The dozens of victims found in that Philadelphia basement were not just statistics.
They were human beings with hopes, fears, and dreams, whose lives were cut short by a man who saw them as nothing more than research subjects. What chills me most about this case isn't just the brutality of Mercer's crimes, but the systematic way he carried them out. This wasn't madness, it was methodical evil disguised as scientific inquiry. If you've made it this far into this investigation, you're clearly someone who isn't afraid to confront the darkest chapters of our history. Our community is growing every day with people who want to understand how these horrors happened, so they never happen again. Join us by subscribing, and let us know in the comments, what do you think really drove Dr. Mercer to commit these unthinkable acts? Was it genuine scientific curiosity taken to its most twisted extreme, or something even darker? Your insights help shape these investigations, and trust me, we have more disturbing medical mysteries coming that will challenge everything you think you know about the people society trusted most. As we close this investigation into Dr. Edmund Mercer's reign of terror, we're left with more than just the facts of his crimes. We're confronted with uncomfortable truths about how society values human life, about the trust we place in those who claim to heal us, and about the darkness that can lurk behind the most respectable facades. The next time you walk through an old city neighborhood, remember the victims of Dr. Mercer, the forgotten souls whose deaths went unnoticed until it was far too late. Their stories remind us that vigilance against evil is not just the responsibility of law enforcement, but of every member of society who values human dignity and life. Because somewhere out there, in some city, in some hospital or clinic, there may be another Dr. Mercer waiting for the perfect victim, someone vulnerable, isolated, and forgotten by the world around them. The question is not whether such monsters exist, but whether we will recognize them before they claim their next victim. The dead cannot speak for themselves, but their stories, like those of Dr. Mercer's victims, can still serve as warnings for the living.